Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
All right. So we're going to pick up where we left off last week. What we've been talking about is morality, and in particular, we've been looking at a theory that's referred to as the moral foundation theory. And this is something that I wanted to introduce to the ecclesia because, for more than any other reason, I believe that it will help us have a frame of reference for when we're speaking to people about difficult and challenging subjects when they have a point of view that's different from our own. So I think that, if you're like me, you probably think that the decisions that you hold are the correct ones. And you'd like to understand, or you would imagine that people would see things exactly as you do. And the reality is that's not the case. Everybody comes to make decisions from a different reference point. And the moral foundation theory is a theory that was developed by a professor by the name of Jonathan Haidt. And I'd like to just sort of get into this and try and develop some ideas from a scriptural standpoint as to why I think it makes sense. So the first thing that we see is that in the beginning, God was the one that controlled the knowledge of good and evil. God said, I am going to allow you to eat of any tree in the garden, but you can't eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. The reason he did that was he wanted to teach mankind that there was a being that was superior to him, and to teach mankind that he was not God. And when man usurped that authority, when man rebelled against God and chose to eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, he did so, and in doing so, man began to define what was good and what was evil for themselves. And when we looked at this last week, we went and we saw how, there was this spiral downward. We had the story of Cain and Abel, and we see an individual who is taking matters into his own hand and doing what's best for him, despite the fact that it wasn't so good for his brother, right? And then we went and we looked at the story before the Tower of Babel, and we read about Cush and Nimrod, who created a kingdom for himself. It was referred to as his kingdom. And this is the first example in the scripture where we see a group of people gathering together for their own mutual benefit, even if it was at the expense of other people and their benefit. And this is one of the problems that we face as a society. We tend to make decisions that are good for me and my family and my tribe, even if it's at the expense of you and your family and your tribe. And consequently, we have to try and get along. And so morality from outside of the Bible, if you think about morality for people who are not believers in God, the reason for morality is to find a system that will allow us to hold selfishness down and give us a framework in which we can all get along. And when this particular author began talking or began writing, he spoke about morality being divided into different foundations, and he likened them to our tongue and to taste buds. And he said humans all have the same taste receptors, but we don't all like the same food. And so last week we talked about some people, really like spicy food. Linda said, I love spicy food. And Sandy loves sweet food. And if Sandy has something that's spicy, she's like, ugh, I don't like this, right? And that can be the same with morality. We can make a decision that might seem perfectly acceptable and normal to me, and yet somebody else might look at the decision that I might have made and said, that just doesn't taste right to me. That just doesn't seem right. And so in his book, The Righteous Mind, he said that the tongue, that the mind is like a tongue with 6 different receptors. And these receptors are care, fairness, loyalty, authority, liberty, and sanctity. And we looked at 3 of those last week, and I'd like to go through all of them again today. And so there are a few things that I wanted to point out. The first is that an individual's moral taste buds, that, you know, how I make a decision about what's good versus what's evil, they tend to be intuitive, based on our life experiences, based on our upbringing, based on our stage in life. We joked about Brother Jack Warner, who said, he said at 18 everything was black and white. And then as I got older, I realized that things weren't quite as black and white as I thought. But now that I'm 80, everything's black and white again, right? So sometimes these things change as a result of our stage in life. And for each one of us, whether we're talking about this moral receptor of care or of something like authority, we're all going to have different weightings. I might find that authority is offensive to me. You know, if I grew up in a home where I had an abusive parent who was always coming down on me, I might look at authority very differently from somebody who had a loving parent who demonstrated authority, but that authority was always done in the terms of what's in the best interest of my child. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Yeah. So let's look at these 6 foundations. The first one, and we covered this last week, the first one was this idea of care. We all want to care for others. That's natural with us. If we see a child that's crying when we walk into the Target store because she's lost her mom, we want to help that baby. We want to help that little boy find his mom. That's just intuitive, and we have an instinct to cherish and to protect the vulnerable. And when we think about morality, we define things that are good as attachment and protection. You know, if somebody is protecting a child, we define that as good. If somebody is injuring or creating suffering or creating pain, we define that as evil. This is sort of an intuitive thing that seems to be built within all of us. And so when we're looking at these topics, we're looking at it not yet from a scriptural standpoint. We're just looking at it from a very general standpoint that would include even people who don't believe in a creator, even people who don't look to the Bible as a guide. These are intuitive moral foundations that tend to be within all of us. So the first one is this idea of care versus harm. Care is good, harm is bad. The second one is fairness. If you treat people fairly, that's good. If you treat people poorly, if you cheat, that's bad. And so instinctively, we want to form partnerships with people. And in order to form a partnership, in order for me to have a relationship with you, I will tend to do nice things for you with the expectation that you will reciprocate. And why would I, so like economics. Economists think it's crazy that people would give to charity. Like, why would people give to charity? This is their money. They've earned this money. Why would they do that? It makes no economic sense. But if you do it in anticipation that others will do it, it eases the burden for everyone. And so this is sort of how that came about. So what's good, we define justice and reciprocity and altruism as good. We define unfairness and inequality and dishonesty as evil. And so our instincts for fairness and cheating is to be friendly in anticipation of reciprocal kindness. And our instinct is when we see someone who's cheating the system, we want to shun that person. We want to identify that person. We want to warn the people in our group about these cheaters. Okay? So that's the second foundation. Any questions about that? The third one that we looked at last week was this loyalty versus betrayal foundation. And when we're talking about loyalty, this is not my loyalty to my wife. We're talking about loyalty to a group of people, loyalty to my tribe, loyalty to Nimrod's kingdom, as we looked at in the scriptures. And so throughout history, people have gotten together to form these groups of people, these tribal groups, because we have realized that two are greater than one. That if we're together with a group that bonds around a common cause, we can provide a better experience in life for everyone in that group. And so our instinct is to not only to form these groups, but to be loyal to them, so long as they're centered around a common cause. You know, and we see this with everything from politics to sports teams. And we talked about the story of the Red Sox and the evil empire, the New York Yankees, right? That's this idea of loyalty versus betrayal. So we've looked at three. Those were the three that we looked at last week. Questions? Okay. So these are some of the newer ones. This is a foundation that's referred to as the authority foundation. Authority is good, subversion is evil. And so people, and again, these are all generalizations, but generally, people want to have some social order in their life. And because of that, we will designate responsibility to people who have traits that we don't share. So for example, if you've watched Survivor, the television show. Anybody watch Survivor? Right? Long time ago, okay? If you watch Survivor, people will get together, they will form these tribes. But once they're within these tribes, they will delegate certain responsibilities to members of that tribe. And those responsibilities that they delegate are sometimes based on experience. I want Mark on my team, and I want to give him the authority to be in charge of fire because he knows how to make fire out of 2 sticks. Or I want to delegate responsibility to Jack because he's strong and he's got experience that I don't have.
Think about that now.
So having honorable, responsible people in positions of leadership, it tends to benefit everybody in the group. And the instinct then is to value that tradition and to obey. The instinct is to obey our authorities, provided that they're legitimate authorities. And when we think instinctively, things that we identify as good would be respect and tradition and customs. Things that we would morally say are evil would be insubordination or defiance. I remember being in school, and we had a substitute teacher come in. And there was one kid in this class that I've never seen anybody treat another human being as rudely as one of my classmates treated this substitute teacher. This was 40 years ago, and it still sticks with me. I could not fathom that somebody could be as unkind as this individual was. And, we feel this indignation when other people are rude. We feel, if somebody is impolite or if somebody disrespects someone, we just instinctively think that that's wrong. Okay? Thoughts about that? The next one that we're going to look at is liberty. People have an instinct to desire freedom, to desire freedom from oppression. I want to be able to do what I think is best for me. We don't want bullies coming in. We respect authorities, but if somebody comes in and usurps authority, if somebody comes in and crosses the line into tyranny and takes advantage of helpless people through dishonest and malicious means, we're going to instinctively say that's evil. And so freedom is good, choice is good, autonomy is good, bullies, oppression, and slavery are evil. And so the instinct is to value freedom, to value authority. The instinct is to fight against oppression. And this is the fifth of the six foundations that we'll be looking at. The last one is purity or sanctity. We tend to view certain beliefs, certain behavior, sometimes even objects, as being sacred. It might be the cross. It might be a flag. It might be a gravesite. Sandy and I tell the story that we thought was comical and other people thought was horrifying. And this, I think, gets to the idea of how some people view purity, that taste bud is so strong. We were toilet training our boys, 4 boys, and we were taking a trip by car from Massachusetts down to Florida. And Daniel decided like 2 days before this trip that he no longer wanted to wear diapers. It was like the nightmare of all nightmares, right? As a father going to all of these nasty rest areas with your child. And so we were coming home, and Dan decided that he had to go to the bathroom. And we were in Washington, D.C. And it was nighttime. It was about this time of year. And we could not find a place for him to go to the bathroom. And so we pulled over, and I opened the door. I got him out of his car seat, and we ran into the side of the, on the sidewalk, and there he relieves himself on the sidewalk right in front of the White House. Right?
That's a sign.
And we thought, isn't this comical? Isn't this funny? And I remember telling a friend of mine, and he was horrified about that. Could not believe that I would degrade, the location of the White House. And so that's an example where, I think it's a funny story, and he doesn't. And it's because his moral taste bud for purity and purity of the White House was so different than mine. Kind of interesting, right?
Does he have any kids?
Yeah, I don't know. All right. So when we looked at this, so those were the 6 different moral foundations. And while there are different moral taste buds, we all use an entirely different part of our moral palette to make decisions, to evaluate data, to determine how to morally choose whether this situation is good or bad. And we looked at this equalizer, and we talked about how some of us will prefer to hear, the bass beats on a song really deep and powerful. And others will dial in the treble so that the high points of the song are more clear to us. And that is the natural inclination that we have when it comes to valuing the moral taste buds that we have. Some will value purity above care, and vice versa. And so when you look at these equalizer settings, some people will categorize each of these 6 foundations relatively equally. They will value care at about the same level as they value purity or sanctity. Other people, on the other hand, will value things very differently. And they might say, you know what, the idea of things being pure or sacred, that makes no sense to me. I'm going to dial that down And care, I'm going to turn that up to 11. Does that seem familiar to you? Now, what the sociologists tend to say is that people in the West, people who are from the West, who are educated, who have experienced the Industrial Revolution, who are rich, and who are democratic, tend to view things from this moral lens. We increase care, and we decrease things like loyalty and authority and sanctity in deference to trying to help the needy. And one of the ways that as I was thinking about this, I was thinking about a topic that seems to get a lot of attention in the Christadelphian community, and it's the topic of humanism, where humanism is, what is good for mankind as being the be-all and end-all. The question that we sometimes hear within the Christadelphian community is, can we be good without God? And a lot of that comes down to how we assess each one of these moral foundations. A humanist, you might say, someone who is focused primarily on the care of human beings and has very little interest in the Bible or in God, wouldn't understand why it is that we would appeal to Scripture. And then when we get together in a room with people, or when we see, or when a humanist might see me making a decision about how I think we ought to, what would be an example? Sex before marriage. The sanctity of marriage. I might say, I think that is an important principle. And I believe from my background and from my understanding of the Scripture that it is important for a husband to be loyal to his wife. We read in Hebrews the other day that the marriage bed should be kept pure. These things are important to me. And for somebody who doesn't believe in God or who doesn't believe these things, they might say, I have no interest in where you stand on that. And if I think I want to do something with my body, who are you to tell me to do differently? And so that's how we can come to completely different decisions and conclusions about moral matters. And I might look at that person and think, boy, I just disagree with that. And they might look at me thinking, I'm crazy. And that's the issue that we have. That's the issue we have. So, what comments do you have? I'm doing a lot of talking.
I find Steve is a group that I grew up with, that we get together a couple of 3 times a year.
Yeah.
And as the years have gone on, the times we get together get sadder and sadder due to their fears and what's going to happen in death. But the rule is you can't talk about religion or politics.
Mm.
And they've known me either from 1st grade or from the 7th grade.
Yeah, yeah.
So they knew that I left the Catholic, they're all Catholics, and I left
Yeah, yeah.
the Catholic Church. And
Yeah.
it's like I'm biting my tongue
Yeah.
to say that, and I sometimes say there is an answer
Yeah.
to this. And I find they just choose not or don't have enough interest in the Bible to find out
Yeah.
the hope that's there.
Yeah. So I mean, I think that's interesting, Gail. Yeah, and I think we probably all experience things like that.
Yeah.
So whether we are, where we are in our equalizer settings on each one of these topics is unique and different for every one of us. And I think that what I'm trying to do in this class is say, okay, we might start with my care setting to 11, but what ought my setting be based on our understanding of the Bible? What ought our settings try, how do we try and normalize these settings so that it relates not just to what feels good, but what the authority of the Scripture teaches? And I think that's where I'm trying to go with these classes. Now, we're talking about these equalizer settings. We're looking at, the individual who has care set to 11. And now what I'd like to do is I'd like to try and understand how good people can be divided by things like politics and religion. And Jonathan Haidt in his book used an analogy. And the analogy that he used was that of a bee in a beehive. And he said, a person whose care foundation, remember that's the one over on the left, my natural inclination to help anybody and everybody that's in need. If I have my care foundation setting turned to 11, and that means that I'm motivated, more or less exclusively on trying to alleviate suffering. And if I see a bee that is suffering, and my care setting is at 11, I'm going to do anything I can to alleviate the suffering of that individual bee. Okay? But a person whose moral settings, the taste buds, the equalizer settings, if they're relatively even along the keel, that person would still be interested in whether that bee is going to survive. But the person will also have a desire to find a solution that contemplates the survival not just of the individual bee, but of the whole hive. And I think that's really interesting, because it's very easy to focus our attention on the one immediate need of this person, and yet resolving that one person's problem might cause the entire hive to collapse. And so what the author of this book is talking about is trying to help people see things more, holistically. What are your thoughts about that? Sandy?
It makes me think of every individual case needs to be dealt with as an individual case.
Mm-hmm.
Whatever the circumstances are, I think, so instead of having everybody at a balanced level, I don't know music very well, but I know sometimes the bass and the treble, is that the treble? If it's all the same, maybe it doesn't sound good, but, in a music, it has to be at all different levels for each note or something like that. So for each individual case, I think there has to be a judgment for what is the best for.
Sure.
That probably has nothing
Sure.
to do with what we're talking about.
Right.
But then who do you have
No,
for a
get-
judge? Who do you have for a judge? Where are they coming from? What do they say?
What do you mean, Judy?
What I mean is, you could have someone else from a different setting or a different group that
Right.
would judge the way they think.
Right.
So there's always gonna be turmoil.
That's right.
And it also makes me wonder how God can judge. I mean, it's really.
Shall not the judge
So
of all.
do me a favor, open your Bibles to 1 Corinthians. And we're going to look at, I think it's 1 Corinthians chapter 3. And what's happening in Corinth is the ecclesia there is struggling. They're trying to make decisions and they don't know how to judge. And so they end up going to judges who were not members of their community, not members of their tribe. They were going to pagan judges. And they were asking pagan judges to make decisions on their behalf. So, where is that? Chapter, I'm guessing 3. First one finds it wins a prize.
prize?
Yeah. What is it?
What verse?
What verse?
It is,
Oh, I was looking for not who can find Corinthians, but who could find the verse. It's talking about going to pagan judges. Lawsuits among believers, chapter 6. Yeah, there it is. If any of you have a dispute with another, dare he take it before the ungodly for judgment instead of before the saints? So we're in 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 1. Verse 2, do you not know that the saints will judge the world? And if you are to judge the world, are you not competent to judge trivial cases? Do you not know that we will judge angels? How much more the things of this life? Therefore, if you have disputes about such matters, appoint as judges even men of little account in the church. I say this to shame you. It's possible. So, Judy, the reason I wanted to go here is because you say, and rightly so, who judges? Who makes the decision? And part of what we believe is that our life experience is designed to prepare us for the kingdom. Our life experience is designed to teach us how to judge on trivial matters. Might not seem trivial to us today, but in the kingdom age, we are going to be kings and priests. And we are going to need to make righteous judgment. And this period of time in which we live gives us an opportunity, I think, to hone our skills. And I think that what I don't want to do is have this class come across as, okay, we all have these different moral settings, so we'll just do whatever we feel is the appropriate thing. We need to learn how to make moral decisions, not on our natural inclination. We need to fine-tune our inclination so that it mirrors what the Bible teaches. Clear? Until we then look at the Bible and we can see that because of our moral inclination to value one trait, care, above authority, we are going to find scriptures that support our view. And we'll talk about that in a minute. All right? So it takes some maturity. It takes some, practice.
You're talking about the judgment for the kingdom, most likely, right?
Yeah, I mean, so we're not going to judge who will enter the kingdom and who will not be, who will be excluded from the kingdom. But we need to learn. I mean, it says in Corinthians that we'll be judging angels. I'm not sure what that means. But the point was, we can't take decisions about ecclesial matters and push them off to some other judge, outside the church. That was the issue that they were going through. Did you have a question or a comment, James?
Yeah, I was
Yeah.
just going to build off what Sandy was
Yeah,
saying.
please.
When I was taking an education course at Bridgewater, there was a distinction between what is equal and what is fair. The distinction between equality and fairness.
Yeah.
In a classroom, if you're teaching a lesson, some students might need more direction than others, and that may not be equal what you give to them, but that's what's fair. So if the entire class has to succeed, you sometimes have to give more time onto others than someone else who might understand it better. And we're told that God isn't going to give us anything that we can't handle. So other people are going to be tested maybe more than us, and some people might be tested less.
Interesting. Good. Now, this is a generalization. And when we think of the analogy of the beehive, people that tend to be interested in the success of the bee, people who are focusing on the individual, tend to value their care foundation, their fairness foundation, and the liberty foundation stronger than all the others. as a general rule, this is how people in Western society view things. Western, educated, rich, democratic, this is how we tend to view things. People in Eastern countries, Eastern society, view things differently. Last week I talked about, I think it was last week, I talked about my friend Jyoti. She's an older client of mine. She had been married for 60 years to a husband that she loved. They had a wonderful relationship. He died. But the story was, Jyoti and Madhukar's marriage was arranged by her parents. If I went to my boys and said, okay, John, Mom and I have chosen a wife for you, that would not go over very well, right? And yet Eastern society, they will value the authority of a father or a mother to make decisions like that. And so this is an example when we're looking at the very broad global picture. If you were to look at a political picture within the United States now, not comparing the West to the East, but let's look at the United States and we'll compare liberal groups to conservative groups. Liberal groups tend to be focused on care and harm, and fairness versus cheating, and liberty versus oppression, whereas conservative groups are going to be focused on things more equally. And yes, they're interested in care and fairness and liberty, but they also will be interested in loyalty and authority and sanctity. And we can see that when we think about politics with this picture. We've got two individuals here. On the left, we have Colin Kaepernick. Colin has a tattoo on his arm with one of the Psalms. Very religious man, they say. And on the right, we have Tim Tebow. Both are kneeling before a football game. Colin Kaepernick, when he kneels like this, he says he's doing it to bring attention to the fact that there are minorities who are being mistreated by police departments, and by certain policemen are getting away with murder. And so he kneels in protest for their situation. A person on the right, a conservative in the United States, who values authority more than a person on the left, looks at Colin Kaepernick and says, he's the enemy, because he is degrading, the authority of police around the country. Or they would say he's degrading the purity, the sanctity of the American flag and the national anthem. He's degrading these things. But a person on the left who doesn't value sanctity the way a person on the right does, doesn't understand what the uproar is all about. And they say it's more important for Colin Kaepernick to draw attention to the harm that's being done to certain members of society, even though it might degrade the national anthem, because that's not an important foundation in my moral taste buds. It doesn't taste wrong to me. And so you can see how people can have completely different viewpoints on very similar things. Tim Tebow never received that sort of attention when he would kneel. He would kneel in prayer. And people who valued the sanctity of prayer would think that he was doing a good thing, whereas Colin Kaepernick would be viewed by those same people as doing a bad thing. And it really has to do with the equalizer settings on their moral foundation scale. Savannah.
I think another thing with that, especially with sanctity, is it's not just what is your equalizer setting at? It's also what are you sanctifying? So you can have a level where you still have something that you hold as very sacred and very holy, but if it's something different than what the person next to you holds as their highest thing that's sacred and holy, you're still going to have like some discord.
Yeah, so an example of that would be climate change. So people on the left, you know, again, these are generalizations, but people who are, you know, on the liberal left side of center would view the environment as being sacred. And people on the right might not see it that way. And so there is a level of sanctity, they're just sanctifying different things. Is that your point? Yeah.
And
Yeah.
like someone from New Zealand with a high sanctity level won't really care about the American national anthem in this situation.
Yeah, right. We were talking about that last night with Savannah, yeah, whose mom was from Canada. So here's an article that was in the Washington Post, and it was about Colin Kaepernick and Tim Tebow. Tale of two Christians on their knees. In many parts of the world, it feels as though the church is separating into two versions. One that values personal piety, gentleness, respect, and cultural mores, and an emphasis on moral issues like abortion, and homosexuality, and other value, and another. So that's the first version, and then the second version would be a church that values social justice, community development, racial reconciliation, and political activism. So the author of this Washington Post article is saying, look, you know, you have people in the United States both claiming to be Christians, and yet they've got completely different views of what Christianity ought to look like. Some are really interested in kneeling in private prayer, but the other is kneeling in public protest. One version of Christianity is concerned with private sins, like abortion, and the other is concerned with public sins, like racial discrimination. One version of Christianity is preaching a gospel of personal salvation. The other is preaching a gospel of political reform. One's reading the epistles of Paul. The other is reading the minor prophets, right? And we see this today, whether it's in politics or it's in religion, we see these divides. And I think the reason for these divides is primarily because we're viewing things with a different emphasis on our foundational moral matrix. So what's the answer? What'd you say?
That's a good question.
What's the answer?
Is it because we're not made perfect yet? You know, we're
Well, I
falling.
think that's part of it. I think part of it is we like to think we're right, and if I've made the right decision, then obviously if you come to a different conclusion, you're wrong. And so my job is try to convert you. And, you know, we might ask the question, how many of us have changed our minds? You know, and we've all changed our minds. But like if you sit down and you think, when did I last change my mind on a really important thing? What was it? It was hard. So like, Gail, I think of you. You know, you were in the Catholic Church and you left the Catholic Church. And that had huge consequences to you, didn't it?
It did.
Huge consequences. And you know, for me to expect that Gail will just lightly say, you know what, Steve, you're right, I agree. I'm going to make this decision, follow you, you know, and I realize that I'm going to have consequences with my parents and with, you know, all the people I've grown up with. I think we have to be aware of that, more aware of that.
I think one of the things, my brother was a policeman, very political, and he was up for promotion and he didn't get the first one, and he was up for lodging and he didn't get that, and he called and said, all these years I thought you were a communist, you didn't vote. Now I get it.
Yeah.
So that was like a
Yeah.
huge, well, no, we're not communists.
So I'm going to just conclude in a moment. Whether you're looking at the Christian church in the United States, we're not talking about Christadelphia. We're just talking about sort of this newspaper article, right? The two versions of the church. You know, each version of that church, people will be able to come up with Bible passages that support their view. And that's because we have naturally a confirmation bias. If I believe that it is wrong to speak against the national anthem, I'm going to be able to go to the Bible and find some verse somewhere that supports my view. it might not be there for everybody to see, but my natural confirmation bias will allow me to find something that will support that view. And we can do that with all sorts of things. I'm going to skip this slide and just go here as sort of a teaser for next week. So when we talk about our community, and we focus on this column here, which is the CARE Foundation. The foundation of CARE is to protect the vulnerable. Within our community, if you are on the right side, the conservative side of our community, we might say, yes, it is important to provide care to the vulnerable, but we're going to prioritize spiritual welfare, and we're going to prioritize our community and individuals within our community over others. And people on the left side of our community, and again, this is generalizations, they might say, well, social welfare is an important thing for us to provide to anyone in need. And so we would then go to the Bible to try and determine how is it that we can back up our positions. And so if I'm on the right side and I say we need to provide spiritual welfare and prioritize people in our community, I'm going to go to Galatians, and we'll read in Galatians that we are to do good works to all men, but especially those of the household of faith. And somebody who's on the left side of the aisle might say, well, Galatians 6 and 10 says we need to provide good works to all men, especially those of the house. It's where you put the emphasis. And the challenge, Judy, is for us to judge righteously. The challenge is for us to take this information and try to determine how best and how it's most appropriately used. And one of the ways that we can do that is by taking the position of somebody on the other side. How is it that they come to their conclusions? And can I make a case for that? So that's what we'll do next week, God willing. Look at some of these things and certain issues within our community.